So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. We are delighted that you can join us today as we explore service provider selection in the ESG era. Today's seminar is the final in a three-part series hosted by IDA Ireland in partnership with my company, Catalina Consulting, and London media house IFI Global. I'm Karina Vaughan. My expertise is in sustainable business growth, and it has been my pleasure to work with IDA Ireland on this ESG focused series of events. And a post-series white paper will be shared with all registered delegates, so please look out for that in your mailboxes in around 2 weeks' time. We have a lot of ground to cover today before 3 o'clock. So if you have a question or a comment for the panel, please do submit them as we go. And we will try to get to as many of them as we can during and after the panel discussion. At around 10 to 3, we will be launching a short poll. This is an anonymous poll, the output of which will be included in the white paper. And next week, we will send out a recording of today's session, and do feel free to share it with colleagues. Our thanks to IDA Ireland for their kind support, and to our excellent panel, who you will meet very shortly. I'm now going to hand you over to our moderator, Simon Osborne, CEO of IFI Global, and I will join you again after the panel discussion. Simon, over to you.
Thank you, Karina, and hello, everybody. I'm delighted you could all join us today. We seem to have a very good turnout today. I'm delighted that is the case. IFI Global is a research and media house based in the City of London, and we will soon be launching our 4th publication, which is for US managers looking for information on what to do when going overseas. And it will have a lot on ESG in it. On the panel today, we have Lorena Dunn, who's partner at the law firm William Fry. We have Byron Fry, who's Vice President Financial Services at the IDA. Caroline Keane is also with us. She's Head of Product Development at Mediolanum Funds. And Bill Prue is the founder and CEO of Indos Financial. Before getting into the panel discussion with them, I'm going to give you a very brief scene-setting presentation. And before that, I would also like to add to what Karina said and thank the IDA very much for their sponsorship of this event today, and for the other ones we've done in this series with them. And apologies to those of you who've been with us for part 1 or part 2 of this series, because you would have seen a very similar slide to this on 1 or 2 of those occasions. But for those of you who are new and or who aren't that close to ESG, as some of us are, I think it is worth starting with some of the figures here. It is astonishing how large this thing has become. The institutions that support the UN's PRI, Principles of Responsible Investing, which is what started the whole ESG revolution, if that's the right thing to call it, have well over $70 trillion in assets. So we've got some way to go from them. The investment houses, the big global investment houses combined have over 100 trillion in AUM. They have those that have signed up for the UN's PRI as well. Of course, I'm sure there's some double counting between the first and second lines on this slide. And then there's this very specific forecast from Bloomberg Intelligence that assets in ESG will reach 53 trillion by 2025. Of course, with ESG, it all depends on what you're counting. We won't get into that today, but it's worth making the point, no matter how you count it, it is very, very, very substantial indeed, and it is growing very quickly. What I wanted to focus on just for a second today is that I think in terms of service provider adoption of ESG standards, which we're going to be discussing in quite a lot more detail in a few minutes, we need to think of this industry in a sort of in the sense of a food chain. Institutional investors were first in. Northern European pension funds were the first to really get into ESG quite some time ago. Canadian pension funds, Australian pension funds, superannuation funds down there are very advanced. They've been doing it for quite a long time too. here in the UK, quite a lot have, especially local authority pension funds. And you may or may not know this, just this week it was announced that the UK government is going to make, pass by law, an obligation on institutional investors in the UK to assess and report on how climate change will affect their portfolios from this autumn onwards, which I think is a very significant development. So from the institutions kicked this all off, and they've got a long way yet to go. The retail investing side has been growing like Billio. Last year in Europe, and indeed in catching up quickly in the States as well, the figures are quite astonishing. I'll just give you some European figures very quickly. Retail mutual funds focused on ESG passed through the $1 trillion mark last year. An astonishing statistic is in the third quarter of last year, 40% of all inflows into funds in Europe were ESG. Now we have an ETF boom in ESG as well. I'm a bit more dubious about that, but there it is, and that's growing very quickly. All of those trends from last year are very much continuing on into this year. Going down the food chain, if that's the right way of putting it, you get to fund managers. In terms of the adoption of business practices by fund managers, it has been somewhat disappointing to date, but we're going to talk about that more in a second. Service providers, if you don't mind, I know there's a lot of service providers on this call today. If you don't mind me saying, you're at the bottom of the food chain, you're going to find, I would contend, that it's coming ESG adoption, whether you like it or not. I want to perhaps start with one of our great failures in research from last year at IFI Global. And last autumn, we sent a survey out to service providers based upon the questions that are on the screen now in front of you in a little bit more detail to service providers, mainly in the international fund jurisdictions. We got an astonishing poor response, but in itself, it was so poor, it was interesting. We never published the results because we just didn't have enough data to be able to do that. But as an anecdotal exercise, it was very interesting. Somebody, for example, I think he was in the Channel Islands, said to one of our researchers when he got the questionnaire, well, why are you sending this to us? What's it got to do with us? We had some similar responses from other people of that nature too. Clearly, it was too early. I expect and hope we will do something similar again this autumn. I think we will get a better response than we did last autumn. We are involved both with different partners in the UK and in the US in very extensive research exercises at the moment with managers on adoption of ESG business practices. Surveys are very different in some respects, but there is also overlap. Where there is overlap, I put in the UK and in the US the similar areas up on the screen. The UK one is predominantly with very large, very well-known, big, huge, massive household name mutual fund houses on their adoption of ESG. We've got, thanks to our partners, more than from us, a lot of the very big boys to participate in this study. We have several trillion in overall AUM. And what's fascinating is how different the replies are. And the same, very different sample in the States and different partner we have in the States for the study we're doing over there with them. We have, I think it's 39 have so far applied, managers replied, and they have, what do they have? Something in the region of 400 billion in AUM combined. And again, extraordinarily diverse set of responses. But we, again, in the US study, we asked the same kind of questions you had on the screen a second ago in the UK. Predominantly, the majority of managers, both in the UK and in the US, whether they're alternative houses in the US or the mainstream mutual fund houses here in the UK, a lot of them haven't got very far in terms of adopting their standards internally for ESG. The overwhelming majority of them are very advanced in terms of their adoption of ESG investing. And this brings up a point that I've been making quite a lot recently. I do think the industry is guilty of what we started to call governance washing, to follow on from greenwashing. In other words, managers are jumping on the ESG bandwagon to gather assets to become more profitable, but they haven't, there are honourable exceptions and it is changing. They haven't yet done very much in terms of adopting their own business practices yet. I'm going to give you just two quick examples. Goldman Sachs Asset Management put out a very bold statement. They were very obviously proud of it. It got a lot of publicity early last year, saying that they weren't going to invest in any corporates anymore unless there was at least one woman on the board. Yes, if you look at the asset management industry, there's something like only 19%. We have another publication called the NED that's done work on this that shows that there's 19% of women on boards, and that's in the international jurisdictions. In the UK, with the authorised fund managers, it's very similar results too. And then, as you may well know, many of you, Refinitiv do this index every year called the Diversity and Inclusiveness Index, their D&I index. Fund managers do very poorly in that too. There's only one that's in the top 100, that's BlackRock, but firms in similar, in many respects to fund managers, tend to do very well in it. The Accentures, the KPMGs of this world, for example, do well, fund managers do not. So fund managers are at the stage now of going out there preaching to the world about how corporates they're going to invest in have to be more diverse, have to be more ecological. They haven't yet, the majority of them, there are quite a lot of honourable exceptions, but the majority of them so far, it appears, haven't done much themselves. But that's yet, and I do think this is going to change. By the way, the results of our research that I've just been referring to will be out and ready hopefully at the end of the month for this month's issue of the briefing report. We're holding it back to try and get that in for this month. And then we will be putting out quite a detailed research document in July. We believe it's the first ever formal analysis of how ESG is changing the fund industry business practices, including service provider and domicile selection, and more importantly, what managers will want to see from their service providers in terms of ESG adoption. So today, these are the four big questions I'm going to ask the panel to address. Will ESG change the dynamics of service provider selection? If so, how? How different will the fund service provider industry be in, say, 3 or 5 years' time from today because of ESG? What can service providers do to aid ESG development? And what should service providers do to prepare for the ESG era ahead? So that's enough from me. Let me bring the panel up. I'm going to make Karina the host, and then luckily my technical responsibilities are over for the day, which is a massive relief to me. Great. Now, I said I'd come to the first person I can see on the screen, and that is you, Bill. So would you like to respond to A, anything you've just heard from me saying there, and B, how you see ESG adoption by service providers?
Yeah, well, just a bit of background. So as you mentioned earlier, Simon, I'm the CEO and founder of a business called Indos Financial. Just very quickly, how we came to sort of become interested and focus on ESG. I mean, we're best known as a depository service provider, but we took a view 2 or 3 years ago that it was clear that ESG was gaining in momentum. And as a depository, you have to do oversight of a fund and its compliance with investment restrictions, etc. So we anticipated that more funds were going to become more ESG focused, would have investment restrictions. We needed to adapt in order to be able to do our job. And so we started on a journey looking at ESG, and it's been fascinating, really. We'll come on to some of my thoughts on this, partly because it's a pretty complex space and it's new for everyone, and that's no exception for service providers. And there is a steep learning curve, a lot of acronyms and different terminology and so on, and lots of differing views. But I think your observations are right in the sense that a lot of service providers are behind the curve on this. There's quite a lot of, smoke and mirrors a bit. I think it's clearly a very, very hot topic. This probably you know, an ESG webinar every day of the week you could probably join and so on. But behind the scenes, is there really a lot of substance to capabilities to support, I guess, is my summation at the moment in the market, with a few exceptions. And I do think that over the coming years, there is going to be a significant impact on service providers, but for reasons to come on to. Maybe I'll stop there. But
thank you very much. Lorena, can I come to you?
Of course, Simon, and it's great to be part of today's session. I guess you've given a brief overview to me. I'm a partner in the William Fry Asset Management and Investment Funds team, but I also am co-head of our cross-disciplinary ESG and sustainability advisory practice. And I came to the ESG space really through an academic interest, I suppose, years ago in international environmental law and human rights, which wedded with my professional experience in the funds arena. Really was the perfect place for me, ESG and sustainability. So I think it's an open-ended question, really. Initial thoughts on the impact of ESG on fund service providers. I think it's probably worth looking at it from two sort of broad perspectives. And the first would be looking at the impact of ESG considerations in terms of supply chain due diligence, actually, and expectations of clients in selecting their service providers in the first instance now. Really, it's about the walk in terms of ESG credentials, and that's what clients are looking at now. And as a law firm, we're certainly seeing that, and something that is evolving significantly. And over the last 5 years, has been quite a change in terms of this moving from maybe an information gathering exercise to clients looking at commitments and ESG related targets and looking for something more substantive from us in that respect. And I think there are some interesting anecdotes. You look at Coca-Cola in the US, for example, and its diversity targets, and how that's impacted on its law firms in terms of weighting that to fee arrangements, etc. So this is only set to evolve further. We have initiatives coming down the track in Europe, like the proposal to set out legislation mandating corporate human rights, environmental and governance, supply chain due diligence. And then secondly, the other perspective is, of course, and very critically, the need to consider how we as fund service providers are really positioned to meet the needs of clients in light of a seismic shift in the regulatory landscape. And so I know there'll be a lot of focus today on how administrators, depository data providers, fintechs can really help with the massive data challenge here. And I know that Caroline and Bill will be well positioned to deal with that. But also, finally, from the perspective of a law firm like ourselves, we definitely see a big role for us as a provider of legal advisory services. And we recognise that there's perhaps a broader than usual role here in terms of assisting clients with upskilling and educating their teams internally and in good time around the myriad of regulatory initiatives, both in play and coming down the track. So horizon scanning is a big piece of that. So plenty of discussion points, I think, for us to deal with over the course of today's session.
Thank you very much. And Caroline, can I come to you?
Hi, thanks for having me today. So yeah, I come from the manager side. I look after product for Mediolanum. I guess I would see the service provider piece a little bit similarly to how we've looked at structuring funds. So 5 years ago, when we talked about responsible investing, with the few exceptions, it was probably around exclusions or best in class. There wasn't really like the Article 9 type of, and that's the terminology we use now, but that type of approach. We would still also, particularly in Mediolanum, see the investing universe as not wide enough to have every fund that you offer as Article 8 or Article 9, just to talk about it in that way. So not every fund can have responsible investing tilt, and we need to give that choice to investors. It's probably a little bit the same trajectory that we're on with service providers. So should we engage? Yes. Should we ask the questions? Should we change our procurement policies? Absolutely. But if we were to choose our service providers and use metrics like Lorena has described, which we really should start moving there, would we have enough of a universe to choose from? Probably not. Obviously, when firms are in the listed space, they're already on this track for different reasons, for their shareholder reasons. But coming at it from the manager point of view, it probably isn't mature enough really in the industry. I think we're at the start of that now.
Thank you very much. And Byron, finally to you.
Thank you, Simon. So just to reiterate, my name is Byron Fry and I represent the Financial Services Division for IDA Ireland over here in the UK. Briefly, IDA, we're the Irish government's inward investment agency for promoting Ireland as a jurisdiction for firms to invest in and grow their businesses. Just to talk a little bit briefly about the fund services sector in Ireland. Currently, it employs 16,000 people nationwide across asset management, depositories, administrators, professional advisors, transfer agents, and other specialist firms who together oversee over 5.4 trillion euros worth of assets under administration. However, we've identified that the, I suppose, the ESG, well, today, global ESG related investments translate to over 1.5 trillion euros in AUM, which presents the fund services sector in Ireland with a significant opportunity for growth. Just briefly outlining some examples of how policy making is driving the evolution of the fund services sector, and also how the how Ireland also at a national level is driving this. We see that the pivoting towards ESG focused investments, it's being significantly accelerated by new regulations contained in the European Commission's Financial Sustainable Growth Plan. Released in March 2018, it set the train in motion to reorient capital flows towards sustainable investing, incorporate ESG into risk management, and encourage greater market transparency. And this fast pace has been reflected by the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, SFDR, which took effect in March of this year, and which we expect is going to be further implementation deadlines later this year. Additionally, there's also like the climate dialogues, which were held in Dublin last month. They issued recommendations that were published ahead of this year's COP26 summit in Glasgow. And amongst these key recommendations is a commitment to the rapid introduction of global reporting and accounting measures to best reflect the potential impact of climate risks to countries, communities, and companies. So it's worth noting that Dublin, it's the European for United Nations Financial Centres for Sustainability, FC4S, which is a network of global financial centres comprising 33 member cities, and the objective of accelerating sustainable finance. And finally, at a national level, the Irish government has also introduced a finance action plan, which aims to develop Ireland as a leading guide for sustainable finance. And during this year, actually, we're going to be publishing a sustainable finance roadmap to guide Irish green and sustainable finance activities in the context of the European Green Deal. I'll just mention briefly as well, along with changes in policy and legislation, investors, they're also encountering pressure to broaden their ESG ambitions from the wider stakeholder ecosystem, that is investors, customers, partners, employees, and suppliers. And in order for the Irish fund services and asset management industry to meet this structural shift, and there's a generational shift in business practices, and implement effective measures for climate risk management, they've had to build up a pool of talent and resources, such as meaningful data sets, sophisticated analytical tools, and RegTech solutions in order to assist their clients with compliance. And here again, the Irish government has also been helping as well through the national agency dedicated to the promotion and facilitation of workforce learning in Ireland called SkillNet, who launched a sustainable finance SkillNet program, which last year trained 1,400 Irish located professionals within the sustainable finance agenda as part of Ireland's Road to COP26 campaign. And then I'll just mention briefly on the technology component. Ireland also is increasingly viewed as a strategic hub for technology innovation within the funds industry. Multiple companies are embarking on tech projects from Ireland, implementing the latest AI, machine learning, NLP, cloud digitalization, and data analytics and risk analytics methodologies in order to exploit the cross-pollination of tech that's deployed across multiple business sectors. And I suppose to bolster this as well, we have a number of research centres which are focusing in these disciplines to very much encourage these firms to investigate, I suppose, R&D feasibility and ultimately locate centres of excellence to develop these kind of technologies to enable gathering of data for ESG data, as well as integrating that into risk metrics and dashboards as well. So I think I'll just stop there and hand it back over to you, Simon.
Okay, thank you very much. So let's get into the questions, ladies and gentlemen, that we touched upon the other day. And the first and the obvious place, I guess, to start is, by the way, I'd love to have some disagreement. And if anyone from the audience wants to chip in with a question, as Karina said, we'll try and take some questions as we go along and maybe have a formal bit at the end for them as well. So the first question is, will ESG change the dynamics of service provider selection? And more importantly, if the answer is yes, if so, how? Who wants to go first with that? Anyone take? Lorena,
Don't
don't hide at the back of the car. Oh, Bill,
I realise now my intro is probably a bit too short, but I'll save the best till last, hopefully. No, I think, Caroline mentioned this, clearly larger firms have already got well-established procurement processes, supply management frameworks. I think from what we've seen when we're dealing with larger firms, they ask more questions about ESG. It's already incorporated into those sorts of processes. Then again, we look at the vast majority of the industry, which is sort of where you deal a lot in the alternative investment manager space, and it really hasn't cascaded down to the level, I guess, in your sort of food chain and so on. So clearly, managers are getting more and more questions from investors about ESG. A lot of managers are having to, whether they're Article 8 or 9 funds, but even if they just want to articulate to their investors what their position is on ESG at a manager and a fund level. But even as part of the manager ESG policy, then we expect them to start to incorporate, they have to really consider ESG factors across their supply chain and their suppliers and service providers and so on. So I don't think it's really cascaded down widely yet outside of the bigger firms. But from a service provider perspective, I think those that are embracing ESG is clearly a big differentiator. Because as I said in my sort of short intro, there's a lot of learning here for everyone in the industry, and managers are no exception. They're under a lot of pressure from investors to articulate where they, their position on ESG, and they need support. Where's that support going to come from? We started to get into this because, as I say, we were looking at how we had to adapt our existing service model to look at oversight of ESG sort of funds and restrictions and so on. And we quickly realized that the industry just needed a helping hand to help them understand, where to start on their ESG journey in terms of, what frameworks were relevant, what their strategy might look like, would they sign up to become a UNPRI signatory and what the implications of that would be. And that's where a lot of people in this industry still are, I feel. And that's before you start getting onto new service opportunities around, reporting, the sort of data transparency, screening of portfolios from an ESG perspective, and other services down the line around assurance and basically providing comfort to your stakeholders that you're doing what you say on the tin in terms of, you're really delivering on your ESG promises. So I think at the moment for service providers, some are really embracing it. Others are not doing much at all. I think those that are not doing much at all have got a lot of catch up to do. It is an evolving space, but those that are embracing it are being able to add some more value to their clients, frankly.
Before we go on to the others, can I just follow up on that, Bill? So do you think, very quickly, do you think the people who are not, you just touched upon, is it ignorance? Because one would have thought from their point of view, the danger is one day it'll happen potentially very quickly. A client's going to come along and say, we'd love to give you this, these funds to administer for the sake of argument, but you need to meet these ESG standards. And if you can't do that on the day when the proposal comes in, you're stuffed. So why do you think, and they must realize that, I would have thought by now, that that's, is it ignorance that they haven't adopted?
No, I don't think it's ignorance. I think it's, there's two parts to all of this. There's on the service provider side or any business side, you've got your own ESG compliance strategy, profile, commitments, diversity, all those sorts of things, the things that you had in one of your slides. And then you've got what is the service opportunity as as part of your business. I think a lot of firms don't necessarily see what that service opportunity is. Or perhaps they are saying, well, this is what we do, and we don't really want to adapt in this direction. So, for example, I see a big opportunity in the market to really sort of move into more of the audit and assurance field. I think there is going to be a big drive over the next few years for, as I said earlier, just sort of providing comfort and assurance that firms are complying with their ESG policies and promises. Well, who's going to do that? But it might be outside the risk profile of some firms. I think it's a big growth area and something that we're focusing on as a result. But it's not. It's thinking outside the box type territory. It's not traditional fund administration. It's not traditional this and that. And I think that's part of it. I've spoken to, you know, a lot of, you know, as I said, we've been looking at ESG for well over 2 years now, and we've spoken to a lot of service providers in the industry. Some of them have got people focused on ESG, but they're saying that it's, you know, trying to get the real investment internally is going to be demand driven by their clients, and that demand hasn't really been coming through yet. So that's my point there. When that demand starts coming through, it's not something you can just switch on. You don't have a lot of people in the industry with a lot of this knowledge. There's a lot of training and education you have to do, and self-study, if you like, to get up the learning curve. So I think there's that investment that will pay off longer term. I mean, I'm not sitting here today saying we're, you know, rolling in orders for ESG services, but there's an awful lot of conversations we're having with our clients and prospective clients about how we can help, and they're trying to understand, you know, what it all means for them. Now that will convert to business in time, inevitably. It's like anything, but you have to make that investment up front.
Thank you. Lorena, you made the point on our prep call, and you sort of mentioned it in part in your first intro comments, that you are looking at ESG for William Fry across the board, and therefore you are in a very unusual and very interesting, almost unique position. You can see how different sets of clients from William Fry are adapting to ESG. And I correct me if I got this wrong from our prep call, you made the point that the fund industry is a little bit behind the curve in comparison with other client areas you have as a business. Is that correct?
Well, no, I don't think the funds industry is behind. In fact, I would go so far as to say the funds industry has been forced from a regulatory perspective into being in front, really. Right. So I think, I suppose from my perspective, my involvement in the ESG agenda obviously started through my involvement in the funds industry. So I suppose we've been looking at this since 2018 when the action plan was launched in the EU. But I suppose going back to your point in terms of how this works more holistically, I think something we had to take a step back and look at through the funds experience and through this body of regulation was how this is impacting on a cross-sectoral basis more globally, and what the connections are between the different clients that we represent across sectors, corporate, real estate. You know, ultimately, the players who are the portfolio companies in which our funds are investing, who are in turn impacted by the likes of the NFRD, the CSRD coming down the track. And really it was about bringing that to the fore and educating that client base on the fact that ESG is not necessarily a fund-specific agenda. And I know there are many clients who are already very much appraised of this. And as I said earlier, we're in fact facing questioning from them in terms of our own ESG capabilities as a business. And ultimately it will come to the point that they will not want to do business with you unless you're able to stand over your ESG capabilities. But from the advisory side, certainly it's been an education for me to step back and take a look at the connectivity between the likes of your corporates, your real estate clients, and equally looking forward to the potential for greenwashing claims and reputation management off the back of this really broad suite of legislation. This is of course something every client wants to avoid, but we really need to be at the ready and poised to deal with claims of that nature down the track. And I know that there's also a focus in the UK and the US in particular on class actions in that space. So in terms of our offering, it's looking at this with that more global hat on. And that way we're more poised to provide, I suppose, a cohesive set of advice and to scan the horizon, because this is really, I think, to some extent unprecedented in its complexity, in its ambition, and the scale and the momentum, you know, behind this at EU level at least. So I think in order to be a service provider who really has something to offer, and certainly in the legal space, that comes down to keeping an eye to the broader picture, as well as the very challenging intricacies of these rules. So that would be my tuppence worth on that, Simon.
Thank you very much. And Caroline, just to remind the audience that, I will tell the audience, you used to be at Man Investments before you joined Media Lanham. So you somewhat imagine a different firm, Man, from Media Lanham, but so you're looking at this and I guess you've got a broader range of perspectives because of that than many perhaps might have. So I'm going to ask the same question from, as you say, as from a manager, but a manager with different perspectives. how do you see, looking down the food chain or downstream from your point of view, service provider selection changing because of what may be happening in terms of what you're doing as a manager?
Yeah, and I think Man is a listed firm and also has a huge institutional investor base, whereas Mediolanum is more of a retail house, and that has different dynamics with it as well, because and ESG really came from, as you said at the start, the pension funds being mindful of their investing and that zeitgeist coming. And then, of course, as Lorena has kind of said, SFDR accelerated that and changed the conversation with it as well. But you certainly have institutional investors looking at your policies and making sure, and asking those kind of downstream implication questions. Your procurement policy, obviously, generally you potentially want to have KPIs with it and so on as well. I think it's interesting, some of the bigger firms, like I saw JP Morgan and Ford have particular, and so at a global level around their procurement, have KPIs in terms of the types of businesses they want to do business with. So whether they're minority owned or have a diversity component and so on. So we don't have those KPIs as yet, but I think that might be coming. I think it's interesting as well that the context of this conversation is ESG shifting our outlook on service providers. But I think there's a couple of more things as well. Like, for example, and even so, China did the national sword. So effectively they stopped taking recycling from the rest of the world. Suddenly, lots of places weren't doing single-use plastic anymore. You couldn't take it. That wasn't really because of an ESG overlay, it was driven by the fact that suddenly we had to be more mindful and more conscious of our resources. But I think that's had a kind of a knock-on implication for a lot of other things and kind of created something alongside, obviously, the fact that we have a climate emergency at the moment. And on the regulatory side, we've seen in Ireland, I think I've got the details right, but a couple of years ago, the central bank did a review of the retail banks because of some of the issues that they had seen, particularly, I think, in the tracker mortgage space. But they partnered with the Dutch regulatory authorities, and one of the key findings was it was culture. So they noted that actually you need to have diversity in your decision-making processes, because otherwise you're in danger of groupthink. So, and that goes into governance, of course. So I think there's quite a lot of things that have combined alongside ESG investing to make suppliers more mindful of the various policies that go into place, and then make firms more mindful of how they select their suppliers. Because, of course, as well, if you select a supplier, for example, that doesn't have good governance practices, but not good diversity either, then potentially they make bad decisions, and you're in a situation where you've partnered with a supplier, because obviously it a lot of the time, as Bill says, it is a partnership and you're consulting with them, and they're not appropriate for your business, and they don't think in the way that you want them to think.
Thank you. Byron, can I come to you and put a slightly different question to you, and maybe because I'm conscious of the time, you always gallop through when we do these things. And perhaps I'm going to put the next two questions together to you all, but starting with you, Byron, slightly adapted with your perspective being in the IDA. The first question was, how different will the service provider industry be in, say, 3 or 5 years' time? And then what can service providers do to aid ESG development? From your perspective at the IDA, what do you think Ireland can do to be absolutely slap bang in centre in making sure that because you've got a huge service provider industry in Dublin, and not just Dublin, across the whole island of Ireland. What more? I know you mentioned some things in your introduction that you are doing. How do you see Ireland developing in this area?
Absolutely. So just to address those points in turn, and just picking out 1 or 2 points of where I see the fund service provider industry developing in the next 3 to 5 years. Well, we picked up on a couple of points this afternoon, focusing on areas such as greenwashing and governance washing. And given that we are going through a significant structural shift, not just within asset management, across numerous sectors, of companies that also that asset managers are investing in, I'm hoping, I'm taking an optimistic view that within the next 3 to 5 years, many of these companies will be much further along in terms of their pivot to incorporate ESG as part of their as part of their central strategy. And as such, then data sets will have also significantly improved to facilitate transparency of the various business practices. Thus, I think leading to a much better situation also for fund services providers as well when it comes to regulatory compliance, tax and accountancy measures as well that they need to perform. So from that perspective, I'm hoping that that's where the industry is going to gravitate to as that shift progresses. And then talking about what the Irish government and how IEA can facilitate all this as well. Well, what we've been encouraging is the active engagement with policymakers within this area. As I hinted at very unsubtly in my introduction, is that Ireland has sought to play a lead role within in this area, and so we're very open. We have a very business-friendly government that is keen to seek feedback from stakeholders in business to influence, policy as it's being developed and regulations as they're coming down as well. We also, as I mentioned as well, we have worked very closely with our national skills body as well, SkillNet as well, in training up the Irish fund servicing workforce as well. We trained 1,600 people, professionals last year within the ESG space as well. So we're really seeking to ensure that the Irish workforce is upskilled and ready for this this challenge as well. Ultimately with the aim of attracting further asset managers to domicile their funds in Ireland to continue to grow the industry in Ireland. And that's also coupled with things like the updating of the investment limited partnership legislation that came into effect at the beginning of this year, the release of a framework for specialised depository frameworks and so on. So there's a lot of moving parts there to just continue to make Ireland a very attractive jurisdiction for funds that would like to domicile themselves in the EU, which is ultimately then a supranational jurisdiction that is seeking to be a world leader within the ESG space.
Thank you. And Bill, can I ask basically the same questions to you, and I'll come to the others as well. How different, if we were doing this in 2 or 3 years' time, will service provision be in the jurisdictions you know well? You have an office in Ireland, although you're based in London, and you travel around, you're very familiar with Cayman and other jurisdictions as well. How different will it be, the service provider, fund service provider industry be because of ESG? What's your forecast or prediction?
It's difficult to say. I mean, it's clearly, I think more firms are going to embrace it. They have to at a corporate level because, as we said earlier, there'll be more questions, and emphasis on it for provider selection. And as I mentioned, I think there's clearly going to be demand for new services, whether that's sort of consultancy, transparency reporting, data solutions, assurance, perhaps advisory work as well, sort of outsourcing some of the investment advisory type capabilities. I think that ultimately the fund services industry's just got a big gatekeeper sort of governance role anyway. If you look at the G in ESG, that goes as well to how funds are operated. We were talking about this the other day on something, Simon. It's a sort of a, I think there is going to be on stronger fund governance, and service provider selection will be a factor of which is the best service providers to support a strong fund governance model.
Yeah, that's interesting. Using service providers as kind of ESG gatekeepers, is that what you're saying?
Well, in a sense, I think because governance, if I talk to some of our clients and the questions that they're getting from investors, okay, there's the G in the ESG from an investment perspective when you're looking at, I'm not an investment person, but when you're looking at opportunities, you're considering governance as well as the E and the S factors, aren't you? But I think it's also, you're looking at the governance of the operation of the manager and the fund. And clearly, the fund service provider industry has got a big role to play in ensuring strong fund governance as a whole and proper quality sort of controls and checks and balances, essentially. Okay,
thank you. And Lorena, from your perspective at a law firm, I'm going to come to the other part of my double barrel question to you, which is let's call William Fry a service provider. Law firms sometimes are called service providers, sometimes they're not. What do you think, what can law firms do to aid ESG development?
So I think the direct question to that I probably touched on earlier, and a large part is really the assisting with upskilling and the internal education piece. So I think we've been offering training sessions with a very significant amount of uptake, I will say, from within perhaps operational teams within management companies and investment management houses that we wouldn't previously have seen that level of interest, you know, and I think that really goes to the extent to which we are all grappling with this body of extensive rules. And I think a point that Byron made earlier is that also there are, of course, external courses, etc., like that the Sustainable Finance Skills Net are offering, but I think there's a large part of that we're attempting also to assist clients with. One thing I did want to mention, because I guess the net answer to this question, how different will the fund service provider industry be in 3 or 5 years' time, depends on, you know, what will the uptake be in terms of ESG by funds and fund management companies. You had some fantastic statistics in your opening slides, but just to add to those, because I think it adds some colour to where we might land within that time frame. Irish Funds, the ESG working group, conducted a flash survey last month on the number of funds that were considered to be green in Ireland as of the 10th of March, which was the first SFDR level 1 deadline. So when you consider all of the uncertainty that there was, and I think still remains really, around the fund classification piece, it was interesting to note that 17% of Irish funds were at that point classified as green. And we know that there will be a lot of funds that are on what you might term a green journey and looking to add environmental and social characteristics to their strategies, perhaps ahead of the 1 January 2022 deadline for the SFDR level 2 rules. And in addition to that, we know as lawyers and talking through the industry groups that there is quite an avalanche of green funds out there already being launched post 10 March. So if you look at those statistics, really Ireland, and I think the funds industry generally, it's very solutions oriented sector. I think fintech will play a big part here, but unless you get behind ESG and are capable of servicing this level of ESG focus by funds and fund managers, there would be the risk of getting left behind. So yeah, that's enough for me, I think, on that point, conscious of time.
Thank you. I'm talking about time. As always, I'm afraid these things gallop ahead, and I'm going to hand over to Karina to do the poll she referred to. And we have had some questions in. I'm sorry I haven't taken any, it's been going along, but we can maybe include some of those in the last part of this session. So Karina, over to you to launch the poll. Maybe whilst we're doing that, we can still talk, because it takes a couple of minutes to do.
Yeah, so I've just launched the poll. It looks like it's live. If you could very quickly make your selection. We have had a fair number of questions in from the audience, and it would be good to get to those as quickly as we can. Okay, so how much more important will ESG be to your business in 3 years' time? Much more, slightly more, or no difference from today? Okay, make your final selection. I'm going to end the poll now.
Thank God you're here to do that. I wouldn't want to be playing the technology on.
Okay, perfect. So we will be keeping the results of any of the polls that we've done in this series for the white paper. Right, so questions in from the audience then. First one, is there one specific area over others that service providers should be focusing on in their ESG implementation? So for example, sustainability or diversity. And Bill, could I maybe ask you to have a go at that one?
You're muted, Bill.
No, that's fine. I think you could argue that you should be focusing on all of them, really. I mean, I think the environmental side, there are some relative forward things you can do, such as sort of at least understand your carbon footprint, set some goals as to how you can reduce that year on year. We became a carbon neutral organisation about 2 or 3 years ago and helped countless firms achieve the same thing. And it's actually not a complex exercise for many firms in terms of just understanding it, and then you can go about implementing measures to reduce it over time. I think on the social side, it's for a lot of firms, it's already been relatively well focused on around diversity and inclusion and so on. So, and that's just expected of any firm nowadays, isn't it, to keep pushing that agenda forward. And then I think on governance, hopefully most firms are well-run organisations anyway. So probably the ones that are need more focus is more on the E, then the S, then the G, in that order, I would say.
Okay. So Bill, thank you for that. And also, so just relating to that, so thinking specifically about third-party mancos, and in particular, the smaller players, are there specific things that they can do to start developing a decent ESG framework? Bill, can I maybe push you a little bit on that one?
Oh, okay. Well, okay. Then my thoughts on that. I mean, that's an interesting one, because clearly the third-party mancos have got the regulatory responsibility. I mean, there's probably many things you could say on this, but they've clearly got the regulatory responsibility to comply with things like SFDR, depending on where they're located. So ultimately, they have to either upskill and understand and learn and be able to really consider that appropriately. They're always going to have to place a degree of reliance on the delegates or the supervisors, etc., or their clients. My personal view is that third-party mancos, there's an opportunity for them as well to really differentiate themselves if they focus on ESG knowledge and capabilities, because not all of them are. Back to this differentiation point again, if you invest the time, then you can talk very knowledgeably and add some value to the clients, and not all firms can do that. So in a selection perspective, it's very worth focusing on it.
Any other comments on that?
I think it is an interesting point to raise in terms, particularly, and maybe this is more of a question, and I thought more so than an answer to the direct query, but when it comes to third-party management companies, a question that does tend to arise is how they will deal with the principal adverse impact question under the SFDR, and ultimately where you have a fund that is seeking out green management effectively, and would like that the manager be in a position, because this is a manager level requirement, to tick the principal adverse impact box and opt in if you're a manager with less than 500 employees. It is interesting to see how that will play out competitively for managers who have the capacity to opt in versus those who do not. It's just a thought.
Can I just jump in, and I'll make a final point on that as well. And I'd also encourage people to look at sustainablefinance.ie, which is the website for Sustainable Nation Ireland. Sustainable Finance Ireland works to support its members to promote thought leadership, raise awareness and excellence and best practice, as well as capacity within the sector as well. So there's very much a drive there as well to I suppose to build out these capabilities in ESG, and so I think they could be a very good port of call as well to do a deeper dive on how smaller firms might transition.
Thanks, Byron. So who should be the right person in a service provider organization to be responsible for ESG policy and implementation? Lorena, would you like to have a go at that?
I wish I had the answer. I suppose there's such a range of service providers. And I know that there was the concept of the Chief Sustainability Officer was touted at one point, at least in ESMA consultations, around the UCITS and AIFMD changes that are in the offing, they're in final form, but around implementation of ESG and sustainability risk in particular. I think that was slightly abandoned. That doesn't mean to say that that the Chief Sustainability Officer is going to be appointed, and I think ultimately maybe the touch point for compliance. But I would also defer, of course, to Caroline and to Bill, who are possibly more on that side of the house and might have their own views.
I can add very quickly, no matter what organisation it is, you want C-level sort of ownership for ESG. I mean, that's the sort of number one point. I believe it should be on every board agenda, and then certain firms, depending on size and scale, etc. Many firms are starting to appoint heads of ESG and so on. I mean, it's multidisciplinary type stuff, isn't it? The social fits with HR, governance, legal and compliance, I guess, and I guess a lot of it might default, frankly, just to finance and facilities, because a lot of it in the footprint for the finance industry is office space and travel and things like that. That's where the carbon footprint is coming from. But ultimately, there's a C-level sort of ownership to own from the top, I guess, and culture and all the rest of it has to be at that level.
Okay, thanks, Bill. Interesting question here. There are difficulties implementing SFDR for fund-to-fund managers who may not have any control over what the underlying fund managers invest into. It would be great to get the thoughts of the panel on this area.
I can take that, Karina, if that works.
Perfect.
Obviously, we look at this from a multi-manager perspective as well, and you don't have control over the underlying funds. But I guess from our perspective anyway, as I said before, we don't think the universe is wide enough that all of our funds can be a responsible investment fund. So they can be Article 8 and Article 9, and we need to give that variety to investors. That said, for a fund to get on our buy list, essentially, we will assess them in terms of their responsible investing policies, making sure they have that in place and so on. So even if this specific strategy that we're looking at isn't a responsible investing one, that we still make sure that they have the policies in place that are aligned with our views. And thereafter, and actually, I think this comes to Bill's point as well, when we're creating product that is definitely in that responsible investing space, it takes quite a lot of thought. So you have to think of the manager from a multi-manager perspective, particularly as you've said as well. You have to think of the managers who are running the type of strategy that you want for that fund, that they will go together, that you might want to have a diversity of managers, and then also the reporting out of that. So if you're happy that the strategies do what they're supposed to do, but then also the metrics and getting that back out and making it look good, there's quite a lot of thought that goes into it. And for me, though others might disagree, I don't think it's off the shelf as yet. I think still for every product, there's quite a lot of thinking and consultation that goes into it.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's not off the shelf. It's a lot of it is very. So if you're talking about transparency, just the differences in different data sets and so on. So when we've done, we're not an ESG data provider, but we have relationships with data providers, which mean that we have the ability to screen a portfolio to shine an ESG lens on it. But very much the reporting we've done is saying, well, you've got to have the managed commentary because they have to explain, it means something to different people in different ways when you look at it. So it's certainly, a lot of service providers, I think, are just trying to put a score on a custody report or this or that, but it's not, there's no one answer here, really.
Thank you, Bill. So we have time for one final quick question. And this one is on technology. So is there a role for technology in helping managers with cost-efficient service provider selection? Byron, you spoke about the different technologies that Ireland has expertise in. What do you think about that one?
Yes, look, I think the adoption of technology is heading in one direction and one direction only. And I guess with the volume and complexity of regulation that has recently come into force and has yet to come in the line, I believe that fund service providers will, just become increasingly reliant on technology in order to remain compliant and in order to efficiently allocate capital in the future. And and these are areas where Ireland has been seeking to build out an advantage. We looked at, I know FinTech Ireland earlier this year released a report about the state of the fintech ecosystem in Ireland, and what they identified was that the second fastest growing fintech subsector in Ireland was in fact RegTech. So it's an area that we're really seeking to build out as a sector of expertise within the country. But on top of that as well, we have a number of university-linked centres for data analytics as well, which are focusing on building out, I suppose, the latest methodologies in analysing large reams of data, building data lakes, organising legacy data, and so on, in order to piece together and build large data sets and gain meaningful insights from them, in addition to creating fresh forms of visualization as well, to be able to easily understand what the data is telling us. And I think all of this put together is what's really going to help service providers get that competitive edge in the future. And I think it's going to be absolutely necessary.
Thanks, Byron. So we are out of time. I'd just like to finish by thanking IDA Ireland for kindly hosting today's seminar. If you'd like to know more about ESG opportunities in Ireland, we would love to connect you with Byron or with one of his colleagues at IDA Ireland. Thank you to our outstanding panel. Thank you to you for joining us. Simon.
Sorry, can I just say a quick word? You're not going to release the poll results today?
In the white paper.
Oh, okay, sorry. I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so you've got to wait for the white paper, ladies and gentlemen, for that. Oh, okay.
Yeah. So thank you all for sharing your time with us today, and I hope the rest of your day goes well. Goodbye.
Okay.
Thank
Bye-bye,
you.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.